coronavirus. Neither the US nor China had an interest in that spreading. We both had an interest in getting good vaccines into everybody's arm around the world. We don't have an interest in proliferation. We both at least have a broad interest in North Korea not going so rogue as to be generally dangerous. We both have an interest in limiting climate change, but that's in theory. And in practice, you don't see cooperation on any of those fronts. And I think the reality is that the competition, which isn't going away and is the dominant strain, the dominant character of the relationship, infects that spirit of cooperation such that on coronavirus, for example, that becomes not an area of cooperation, but rather another vector of competition.
I'm Steve Orlins, president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by Ambassador Robert Blackwill and Richard Fontaine. Ambassador Blackwill is now, I won't go through all of his accomplishments and his incredible career, because if I went through his and Richard's, we wouldn't have time for the discussion. But I will say he's currently the Henry A. Kissinger Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations for U.S. Foreign Policy. And Richard is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for New American Security. They've written what is really a fascinating, for me, I guess, because it's my life, a gripping book on the lost decade, which is intended to refer to what America has done since Hillary Clinton announced the pivot to Asia in 2011. It is, and let me tell you, and I'm a tough critic, you both know, it is a meticulously researched and footnoted book. In fact, I found myself flipping back and forth from the statements to the footnotes, whose central theme is that the pivot was the right policy, but America has lost by failing to implement it. In great detail, it analyzes the costs and benefits of the pivot and concludes, but I'll let them discuss in greater detail, that we need to restart that effort. What I agree with most in the book is the author's urging for a diplomatic and economic pivot to Asia, especially having America apply to join the CPTPP. Glad that at least 3 of us believe that that still should occur. And I think they really make a compelling case, even if you don't agree with the author's conclusions, and I often don't. This is a must-read for those who work on U.S.-China relations or who work on grand strategy. So let me start off with a question, which is, what provoked you to write this book? Was there a particular event that occurred, or was it just that 10 years had gone by since the announcement?
I'll start this off, and Richard will chime in, and we'll follow that as we go along. But Steve, thank you very much for having us. Richard and I have been interested, as you have been, for most of our careers, in grand strategy. And as we thought about the latest iteration, we both became fascinated with the Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama initiative, which now we've all normalized, but at the time was a radical departure from American history and our grand strategies to that moment. In a 6,000-word essay, she proposed that the United States, for the first time in its history, have Asia as its #1 priority, not at the exclusion of other regions. We have vital interests elsewhere as a global power, but she made a cogent and persuasive argument for that proposition. And I stress again how radical it was at the time. And so we decided that while all of these folks who worked on, engineered that initiative through various administrations thereafter up until today are all around, and many of them are our good friends, that we would write a history of that pivot. And that's what we've done. I'm delighted that you found it bibliographically persuasive, because I've been myself influenced by Mike Bloomberg's line for his philanthropic efforts, which is believe in God, everybody else bring data. And there is much data to support the conclusion we came to, which is there has been no pivot. And we enumerate in detail why that's true, and come to the judgment that because there's been no pivot, and in view of what we call the astonishing rise of Chinese power and influence in the 2010s, the United States is in a weaker position now than it was when Hillary Clinton gave her speech. Part of it is, and I'll conclude here, part of it is because of China's rise, but part of it is also in a major way because of America's mistakes and in some cases myopias during that period. So that's why we decided to write the book. Richard may well chime in here.
Well, the only thing that I would add is the reason why this seemed so compelling was because it was of obvious historical interest, but not only of historical interest, because we initially started writing this, researching this after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, of course, we have raging wars both in Europe and in the Middle East, when Asia is the stated priority region of the US government, and now has been under multiple presidents. And we have a real challenge about how we distribute scarce national security resources, time, attention across multiple theaters, how the United States maintains its position as a global power, but nevertheless deals with the challenge that China poses in Asia. There's no easy answers to that, but we thought that the process of going through the pivot might give some lessons that could be applied today, and I think they do. So that was the sort of prescriptive element of it that we found valuable.
Do you think the pivot or the announcement of the pivot had an effect on the instability that now exists in the world, that, you know, by kind of diverting our resources, we allowed, or we sent a message to Russia, it was okay to invade. We sent a message to Iran, it was okay to create instability in the Mideast. We weren't going to be there. I know what the book's answer is.
Well, let me take this one too, and then I'll get Richard to take the next several. The book makes the point that despite the fact that no pivot took place, nevertheless, in Europe and in the Middle East, there was a broad conviction that it had. And so after it was announced, and typical with many American initiatives, there was no consultation with any of our allies before we pulled this out and made it public. In Europe, there was a broad feeling that this pivot was going to weaken America's commitment to NATO and to Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. And in the Middle East, there was the view, it propelled the view forward that America was going home. And I think that did have the effect over the 2010s that you just mentioned, Steve, that countries, and this is treated in great detail in the book, began to accommodate what they regarded was a new reality. That is to say that America was on its way home, that it was an unreliable partner, our friends thought, and a weaker adversary, our adversary, Iran, thought. And everybody started making accommodations, everybody. And that's detailed in the book. And of course, produced instability.
what we are always debating in the China world, and what we all talk about, is how much has the pivot and kind of a more bellicose statements from the United States affected Chinese defense spending, or was it kind of baked in the cake that they were going to do what they were going to do no matter what the United States did, and what we should have done is simply been more confrontational in Asia?
Well, we look at the pattern of Chinese defense spending as best as you can tell the numbers. And by all accounts, around 2000, so about 24, 25 years ago, Japan was on par with Chinese defense spending, and actually with a couple of other countries in the region. And since then, there's just been a straight and up to the right trend of Chinese defense spending, while the rest has been relatively flat. I think it's worth keeping in mind that long stretch of time, because people sometimes will say, well, you know, Xi Jinping suddenly produced this military that they have. Well, Xi Jinping couldn't have produced the military that he had. This military was in the process of being built over years. I think the catalytic moment for the Chinese was actually the 1991 Iraq War, where the Chinese saw how quickly the U.S. military, given its capabilities then, was able to wipe away, you know, a million-man army in Iraq. And they said, well, we've got to get our act together if we're going to be a significant military power. And you see a lot of the study, the modernization, the increases in defense spending and so forth start around then and just continue until the present day.
Ash Carter made the argument, Steve, that he quoted, and it's in the book, Harold Brown's view of Soviet defense spending. Harold Brown said, when we build, they build. When we don't build, they build. And one of the beguiling questions addressed in the book on this score, the excellent question you asked, is the Chinese, with all of their scrupulous analysis, surely knew early on that no pivot was taking place. They were rhetorically against the pivot, but must have known it was not taking place, that our assets, in fact, in Asia were weakening. But they used the pivot as a rhetorical talking point while they sought, with some success, to reverse the military balance, especially close to their shores. And that, of course, is related to Taiwan and the question regarding Taiwan.
Yeah, what about the argument that in 1996, when Lee Teng-hui visited the United States, and that was, literally in the days leading up to his visit, we were telling the Chinese this would not occur. We understand it is a violation of our commitment. When that occurred, they realized that they were simply militarily incapable of doing anything. And that from that became actually the pivot point for the Chinese, when their very low defense spending as a percentage of GDP began to go up enormously. So it was actually within our control, and that we pushed them into doing it.
Well, when we had, again, I think 1991, all the historical evidence seems to be the real, for lack of a better term, pivot point in Chinese thinking about their own military and what capabilities they would need in the face of a U.S. military that had lots of things they didn't, like precision guided munitions and all kinds of other things. Certainly, I think the Taiwan Strait crisis, the sailing of a U.S. carrier through the Taiwan Strait, the Chinese certainly took, one, as a humiliation, a political humiliation, and two, something that they wanted to have the military capability to prevent. And so over the years, they invested in carrier killer missiles and things like that that would have the effect of making the area around Taiwan and ever further away from it impermissible for U.S. naval forces. So I think that was certainly, the sailing of that was certainly a contributing factor. But it also, the sailing of that seemed to also have a deterrent factor on China. So I mean, you'd have to net that out.
Steve, let me make a point here, if I might, which is important to remind the audience. When Hillary Clinton launched the pivot, the sentiment in Washington, the consensus, was about 180 degrees from what it is now. That is to say, the notion that China might become a responsible stakeholder in the system, the phrase coined by Bob Zoellick earlier, was still the consensus in Washington. And we now know, we interviewed these people, that there was the engage and hedge idea, which, but there was the very strong impetus toward engage and to bring along to persuade China to join us in, let us say, our definition of world order and the rules that should govern it. It was only in the 2010s, as the years went by, that sentiment began to change, as we know, and more recently to accelerate, where now the consensus is exactly opposite.
Yes, I think it was shifting by 2011. I always date the banning of Google, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. That was kind of the beginning, and that was in the Hu Jintao. You're quite right when you say Xi Jinping inherited a lot of this. That was during the Hu Jintao era, and that was certainly created the shift that Bob is referring to. I think that's right. You talk about, I've worked with AIIB a lot, and you have a portion of the book that talks about international organizations, and you say, that the Chinese have created and promote economic organizations initiatives that exclude the US, privilege China's position, and undermine global rules and standards. And, RCEP and BRI, maybe you can argue that, but AIIB, I don't quite understand why you have AIIB in that category.
Bob, I don't know, Bob, if you want to come in on AIIB. I think AIIB is probably the one that does so the least of the three that we had. I mean, BRI probably the most, and RCEP, I would guess, is in the middle. But as an alternative structure to the existing institutions, I mean, that was something that is a bolt-on to the kind of current elements of, I guess, the international economic order. And so, I mean, ultimately, I think the opposition of the United States to AIIB ended up being, it was unsuccessful, right? Because, I mean, ultimately, the U.S. picked a fight that it could not win and could not prevent even its closest allies from joining up in AIIB. So, some of our friends would argue that there are, as opposed to either being all in or all out with AIIB, there's some other ways of dealing with it effectively by marrying it up with the World Bank and on joint lending and things like that. And maybe those kinds of things are possible. But, ultimately, it became a diplomatic fight as much as an economic initiative.
Yeah, and our approach, as Richard has said, not just a diplomatic fight. Our policy was a diplomatic fiasco for the reasons that Richard said, and it undermined our case in the region, and suggested to the region that at least in this instance, the Americans weren't reasonable. And we could persuade none of our allies to join us, of course.
Yeah. One of the questions I had throughout the book is how much of what the Chinese are doing is a reaction, and how much of it, as I said before, is baked in the cake. So, you were critical of Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, some of the other regional organizations China has formed. But can't the Chinese just sit there and say, well, you've got AUKUS, the Quad, IPEF, and all these other things. So you guys are doing as much, if not more, than we are.
Yeah, I mean, one hears from time to time the argument that, the only way China will turn into an enemy is if we create the policy that makes them so and stuff. I think that really robs the Chinese leadership of a lot of agency, and it also doesn't seem to match up with their own stated plans and objectives, where they have said and articulated China's return to the world stage as a great power, and they want both the diplomatic assertiveness, the economic arrangements, and the military capabilities that go along with that great power. Their dominant role in Asia, and for at least a number of years, their belief that the West and the United States in particular was in secular decline and was clinging to an anachronistic world order that represented Western preferences at the expense of China, and that something needed to be done about that. Then you look at kind of the more micro level, right? So, I mean, the Quad existed and then it stopped existing for a while for the very reason you said, because it was seen as too provocative, but China's behavior didn't become sort of more friendly after the Quad was abolished. And then when the Quad came back, the Chinese said, well, see, you're surrounding us with the Quad. So, it just doesn't seem that the sort of independent variable here was the United States and its policy choices, and China was solely reactive in this, but actually the Chinese have ideas of their own and are acting accordingly.
Yeah. One of the
I
parts,
suspect, Steve, can I just say it's a combination of the two, because these are human beings we're dealing with, and they are, of course, affected by their perception of our policy, just as we are. But I think the data we roll out in the book strengthens the argument that Richard just made, that they were intent on becoming a great power in Asia and beyond, irrespective of what we did. But certainly some of our decisions and undoubtedly push that forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly the right way to put it. One of the parts I love about the book is it kind of takes me back through the last, 13 years, and just it allowed me to relive a lot of these events. And one of the events was when the Trump national security strategy came out, and the book talks about that, and it for the first time, it called China a strategic competitor and a revisionist power. And I kind of said, strategic competitor, maybe, but revisionist power while we're withdrawing from the Paris Accords, while we're withdrawing from UNESCO, while we're doing all these other things. I kind of thought, who was really the revisionist power here? The United States and China. You guys didn't really opine on that in the book. What do you think?
Bob, do you want to take that on, or
I'm happy to go ahead.
jump in too?
Way.
Go for it.
Okay. You can have competitive revisionism, if I may put it like that. There's no doubt that some of Trump's behavior was revisionist, and that's probably even too polite a word to use to describe some of his decisions. But that doesn't change the policies that China has been following, and in fact has been accelerating. So if we bring the book up until January, when we had to essentially close down the redrafting and updating because of the publisher, I think that the evidence is overwhelming that China now, under Xi Jinping, works systemically to weaken America's role and views of the essential characteristics of world order. And it makes that argument in great detail across every dimension of China's external policies. And how much of this is reactive and how much of it, and Richard and I favor the balance in the other direction, that it's an expression of Xi Jinping's views of the international order and China's role in it, irrespective of whatever tactical mistakes we've made.
Where's the room for cooperation?
There's not much in practice, although in theory there's plenty, right? So just because the United States and China have conflicting interests in a bunch of areas, and we try to lay out what those are, we've talked about some of them, they have coinciding interests in some, right? I mean, coronavirus, neither the US nor China had an interest in that spreading. We both had an interest in getting good vaccines into everybody's arm around the world. We don't have an interest in proliferation. We both at least have a broad interest in North Korea not going so rogue as to be generally dangerous. We both have an interest in limiting climate change, but that's in theory. And in practice, you don't see cooperation on any of those fronts. And I think the reality is that the competition, which isn't going away and is the dominant strain, the dominant character of the relationship, infects that spirit of cooperation such that on coronavirus, for example, that becomes not an area of cooperation, but rather another vector of competition, right? So we're competing against each other. And so yes, I mean, people say, look, the US and the Soviet Union helped eradicate polio together, or, you know, they had the Apollo-Soyuz space project, sort of look for these areas that even in the fiercest dark days of the Cold War, we could work together. And that's true. But in practice, it seems very hard, and particularly from the Chinese perspective, where they sort of resist the delinking of issues the way that sometimes our administrations will like say, well, we'll compete vigorously over here, but we're going to cooperate in these other areas there. And they say, no, part of the price of cooperation is to dampen the competition. So I'm actually quite pessimistic about the prospects in practice of cooperation.
Even despite the meetings we've seen on climate change, with some substantive improvement, you know, it's joint research in medical research. I mean, there are still lots of areas where we can cooperate. We saw, as a result of the November 15th last year meetings, we saw the Chinese really crack down on the precursors to fentanyl. And that, when you talk to the administration, they believe that was a real commitment. And last time I spoke with them on this issue, they closed 60 suppliers, 60 suppliers. It's significant, and it had a real effect. So isn't there more that we can do together? And isn't that in the interest of the American people, rather than defining it all as competition?
Well, we don't define it all as competition, and I don't actually think anyone, well, I mean, I'm sure some do, but I think the general consensus is that the competition, the reality of competition, should not exclude areas of cooperation where that's in our interest. But I think the examples that you're giving are the outliers. I mean, those are few and far between. So if the question is, could we find other ways to cooperate? Yeah, absolutely. Will we? I think it's a very different situation. And, you know, fentanyl, I think, is a good example of it. The United States makes something the #1 talking point and the #1 sort of bilateral ask of the Chinese, and it doesn't cost the Chinese a whole lot domestically or internationally to actually do that, then you could probably get somewhere. On other things, COVID, for example, it's a lot more difficult.
Yeah.
I would say, Steve, I know, always trying to look around the next corner at US-China relations and what lies ahead. And in the spirit of the question you just asked, and consistent with what Richard just said, I think this year, both sides hope for a tranquil year. Both the president, our president, because of the election, and the Chinese president, because he's got plenty to deal with in his domestic economic challenges. But I worry very much, and the book worries about what lies ahead, especially regarding Taiwan, because neither side has shown, with respect to Taiwan in the last few years, the restraint, the mutual restraint, that was the essence of the one China formula. And both are pushing at the outer, maybe beyond the outer edges of the one China concept. And that's exceedingly dangerous, exceedingly dangerous. And I think, as Richard just said, overwhelms whatever other cooperation we have on other issues. And Henry Kissinger, my mentor, and I know you were close to him too, Steve, worried to his dying day about this direction in U.S.-China relations. And I'll just end this answer like this. You would think that the United States and China, recognizing the danger of a confrontation and even conflict over Taiwan, would be working hard to show more restraint and to perhaps even modernize the concept. And yet what they do is get together and read their canonical concepts to each other with no movement. And I think that's, given the trends in Taiwan, a recipe for a crisis down the road, and perhaps not so far down the road.
I was one of the first people, partly because we were running a Track 2 dialogue on maritime issues, who was critical of the Chinese position in the South China Sea. And I said early on it was a violation of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, and the Chinese position was inconsistent with that. Some Chinese have responded, without really disputing my position, they've responded, but compare it to your invasion of Iraq, where the Secretary General said, this was inconsistent with the UN Charter. How do you respond to that kind of question? So they don't dispute my argument. They just say, but you, the Americans, were much worse. I think you were both in government at that time.
I was in government.
Yes.
I certainly was. Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you respond?
Well, I mean, if I think back to my time, when I was an extremely junior person in government at that time, the legal arguments, at least the Bush administration was making, when apparently the Secretary General didn't accept this, but nevertheless, he's not the final arbiter of these things, was that there had been the authorization of the use of force under Chapter 7, and the condition for the ceasefire was the full disclosure of Saddam's weapons programs. The UN had determined that he was in material breach of his commitments and had not made such full disclosure, which allows the continued use of force under Chapter 7. So that was a legal case. How much people were persuaded by it, is another story. But I mean, I think, one can always get into the, well, what about this and what about that and all these other things. I mean, the reality is, if we're talking about the South China Sea, for example, we're talking about the South China Sea, the Permanent Court of Arbitration said that these claims were not, solid, and that China said, although we are party to the UN Convention of the Law on the Sea, which gives jurisdiction to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, we will ignore the judgment. And now they're trying to prevent, the Philippines from resupplying Second Thomas Shoal, for example, and things like that. So, you can have these kinds of debates, but, at the end of the day, the South China Sea is a live issue today, and China's enforcement of its claims or lack thereof is having material tensions in the region, and I think have to be addressed in that spirit.
I think it might have been Cicero who said, beware of those who argue of your perfidies while trying to excuse their own. And I think Richard's point about the current situation doesn't, and the China's historical analogy, doesn't excuse their behavior in the South China Sea, which you, as you said, have condemned from the beginning.
Yeah, yeah. we won't have time to get into it, but I was with a senior Chinese official last night, and we were talking about international law with respect to the Mideast, as you can guess on what, but we don't have time to talk about this.
Let me ask one final question, which is, again, the book just lays, it's chronological, and then at the end, it kind of lays out the policy recommendations, just to kind of whet people's appetite to read the book. Talk about the policy recommendations at the very end.
Richard?
Yeah, we have several, and we intended to be and present kind of an illustrative to-do list rather than an exhaustive list of all the things that the United States should be doing. But among the things that are on our list are to continue to strengthen Indo-Pacific alliances. Militarily, especially, the current administration has made some significant progress over the last couple of years, but still many things that we can and should be doing. We would like to have a trade policy in Asia, joining CPTPP, or if that proves to be a political bridge too far for the moment, how about a regional digital trade policy that wouldn't have some of these market access issues and things like that, but rather would set the rules according to our preferences rather than someone else's? That could be a stepping stone, some sort of economic leadership, a major increase in the defense budget. The defense budget this year will be about 2.7% of GDP, so it's very low by historical standards, and instability and need and demand in multiple regions of the world. Redeploying military assets from the Middle East, where that can be done, to Asia, using the Middle East as sort of a surge area to bring in assets from other areas when necessary, drawing down some of the plus up that we've done in Europe after the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a reassurance mission, and using some of that for Asia, making our European allies central in our China strategy, rather than saying, well, the Europe, you deal with your own neighborhood, let us handle Asia. The Europeans are critical, especially on the economic and technology issues, which are, visceral in this relationship with China. Support the forces of democracy and liberalism, which we think is a comparative advantage of the United States strategically, in addition to being the right thing. And I would say, maybe, Steve, to warm the cockles of your heart just a little bit, pursue bilateral diplomacy with China. So is it hard to find areas of cooperate? Yeah. Are we going to solve the structural issues that have produced such a broad competition? No. Are we going to have conflicting interests? Yeah. That's all reasons for diplomacy, not reasons to get away from diplomacy. And ultimately, we have to be focused on making sure that these two great countries never go to war with each other. Because if they do, you could identify a winner and loser, but we both lose in a major way. So diplomacy can help, and we think that that's the adjunct of what I would describe as a highly competitive approach to relations with China.
That's why the book is really worth a read. I mean, it just covers everything in the last 13 years and has recommendations that I think our listeners are going to have to agree with some. Some are just perfectly logical, and they don't have to agree with all. But Bob and Richard, thank you so much for writing the book. Thank you for joining us. It's called Lost Decade, the U.S. Pivot to Asia and the Rise of Chinese Power. It's on sale, I assume, now.
It is. It's available both in hard copy and in Kindle on Amazon.
Great.
Thanks for asking.
Thanks for writing, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Steve.